Should the Senate be abolished, reformed, or left the same? In recent years, a lot of political analysts have been discussing an increasingly pressing issue: the makeup of the Senate. It's becoming clear that as more Americans choose to live in a handful of highly populated states, the Senate is gradually becoming less representative of the country. In modern politics, this often gives the small rural Republican states more sway than their large urban Democratic counterparts. Some progressive political analysts notice the inherent undemocratic nature of the Senate, and thus would like to see it either reformed or abolished entirely. In contrast, many moderates and conservatives seem to take a more favorable tone, noting the stability and checks on political power that the Senate provides. So my question is: should we as Americans be looking into abolishing reforming the Senate? Why or why not? The reality is that the makeup of the Senate is extremely specifically laid out in the Constitution, so it would require an amendment to change. That is impossible in our current and probably future politics, partially because of the Senate itself. So there is no real democratic path to changing it. Is the question just theoretical, or are you proposing overthrowing the government more likely than democratically changing the Senate? I am just going to point out that when the Allies determined the political system for Western Germany after World War II, they modeled it pretty closely after the US. The two biggest differences are the Supreme Court elected alternately by the upper and lower house, with a maximum term of 12 years and a maximum age of 68 years per judge, and the upper house, which consists of 3-6 senators per state depending on the population, serving at the pleasure of their respective state governments. There should be 3 senators per state, that way there is a Senate election every 2-year cycle in every state. No more bad Senate years or good Senate years for either party. Voters in every state get to influence both houses of Congress every election cycle. Left, the Senate is functioning as intended. The House and Electoral College are not. The size of their house should be at least doubled. That would help with the Electoral College bias in favor of small states. Repeal the 17th Amendment. Put the election of senators back in the hands of the states' legislatures. I mean, in an ideal world we'd abolish the Senate and create a much bigger, more representative House, with close to 1,000 representatives. Obviously, unless we have an actual split in the US, that barrier to change is nearly impossible. The root problem with our government is that it was designed from the ground up to accommodate slavery. Specifically slave states. Chattel slavery was, of course, abolished 160 years ago, but we kept the exact same federal structure that maintained the outsized power of rural states. The irony about the upper chamber is that its conception was the result of smaller states fearing that bigger states would bully them by way of having more congressmen due to population. Now smaller states use the Senate to bully larger states. Why the hell would you get rid of such a major institution that has worked across dozens of generations since 1776? Knee-jerk crap like this is why our amendment process is so difficult to achieve, and thank you Founding Fathers for that. The left thinks it's unfair because it's completely undemocratic, the right thinks it's fair because it's working in their favor. We are not the same. It made sense at the time, but there's no logical reason for Rhode Island to have as much pull as California. The Electoral College needs to go first, though. I don't believe that the Senate can be constitutionally abolished. However, a more successful strategy might be to limit its authority, the way that England has done with the House of Lords. This would, however, require amending the Constitution, and it is hard to see a pathway forward why the rural smaller states would agree to give away their unfair outsize anti-democratic influence in the Senate. The problem with the Senate is that states are arbitrary horseshit with no other purpose than to undermine federal authority. Countering poor should be trusted to a national majority through direct plebiscite. Between the Senate, the filibuster, the Electoral College, and gerrymandered House districts, I feel like we've got at least one too many anti-majoritarian measures in place to prevent voters from ever seeing the policies they vote for enacted into law, barring some kind of multi-cycle wave election that may happen once in a generation. But it's all a moot point because we also have the hardest constitution to amend of any constitutional republic. Repeal the 17th Amendment and put senators back in the hands of the states. The Senate is supposed to be slow and not subject to the whims of public opinion. I would be okay with it remaining the same if we break up California and Texas into more states, add Puerto Rico, combine Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana into one state, and combine the Dakotas. Left alone. You cannot trust modern politicians to change the Constitution, not one of them. Why would the other states stay in the Union if they're just going to be run roughshod by California, New York, Texas and Florida? The answer here is to return more power to the states. 330 meters is too many to find a consensus on many issues. Let them instead be state-level debates to be had. Interesting. Thank you for sharing this perspective. This has never been discussed in my progressive circle. While it makes for a fun what-if discussion, any attempt to abolish the Senate would be a huge waste of time. The Senate is so far gone from what it was designed to be and what it is now, it is time to consider removing it. It no longer serves the purpose that it was intended to. By design, each state government had two directly appointed senators. The 17th Amendment was passed and now it's by direct vote. Senators no longer represent the interests of the state but the people of the state. In the YND states that have one representative, there is no difference between a senator and a representative. If you abolished the Senate and gave each state two at-large districts, then nothing would change. The senators made the rules and they can change it at any time. In the past it was the simple majority vote, rather they pushed it to 65, making it difficult to pass anything. Senate is fine but the filibuster needs to go. Gerrymandering should also go, but that doesn't affect the Senate nearly as much as the House. Abolish the filibuster and greatly expand the House as the founders intended. You might as well ask if the United States should be abolished. If progressives want to alter the foundational political contract of this country because, through their unwillingness to negotiate and make concessions, they can't get their way, then there isn't any reason to keep the country together. Do people just not understand civics? We have a chamber with equal representation. It's called the House. Checks and balances, people. No, it should be left the same. When the country was founded, the House of Representatives was founded to reflect populations of a state, and the Senate was for each state to have only 2 seats. This was done to prevent majority tyranny and allow small states some more even say compared to large states. That being said, large, more populated states still have more say overall since they have way more representatives in the House. I do feel the Senate, in order to achieve more equal representation, should be reformed. One potential approach could be to adjust the number of senators per state based on population, or to introduce a system of proportional representation. However, to change the current Senate would require significant changes to the United States Constitution, which is a complex and rigorous process. I'm not sure in the current climate in the US we could come to an agreement. In modern politics, this often gives the small rural Republican states more sway than their large urban Democratic counterparts. This was the entire reason for the creation of the Senate, to act as a bulwark against majority tyranny. There is no good reason to abolish it, and as the resident of one of the nation's smaller states, my vote is to keep it. The Senate structure was purposely designed by the Founding Fathers. It meant to give the smaller, less populated states a voice. One cannot claim that since the small states are less populated, the Senate format should be changed. It achieved its original goal. As an aside, I think the way the POTUS is elected should be modified and the electoral college should be abolished. Since the president is one position that serves all Americans regardless of their state, it should go by the popular vote. If such change is introduced, the Senate can remain as is. Honestly, thank God for the Senate. Whether it's GOP or Democrats in charge, they're the real check on popular opinion at the moment.